2 winters after they valued her inheritance at £9. Garnet Hurdis stood in her yard with his hat in his hands and an order for 400 tons. Rachel Cardew let him wait by the pan-house door while she finished the draw. It had started at her uncle's table in the spring of 1855. Hurdis and Cropper kept the wharf, the witch house, and the good pans. She got the low pans out on the moss, 3 drowned pans, a shaft capped with a rotting plug, and the rates. She had gauged brine since she was 11. Her uncle used her figures for 20 years and never once wrote her name beside them. The lawyer told her the low pans would cost more to hold than to leave. She held them anyway. In the November floods that year, the moss went under. Every man in Saltworks said the pit was finished. Rachel walked out along the wet track, pulled the plug off the shaft, and let her line down into what should have been ruined liquor. She hauled up brine so strong it burned the split in her thumb. She stood there a long time before she understood what it meant for Hurdis. The valuing had been in March, in the counting house over the wharf, with the weaver running brown and fast under the window. Edmund Cardew had been 3 weeks in the ground. The partnership deed let the surviving partner buy out the dead man's share at a valuation, and Hurdis had given notice before the funeral meats were cleared away. Mr. Peck came over from Northwich to do the figures. He was a dry man with a habit of reading aloud whether anyone listened or not. Wharf and witch house at book value. 6 pans, the horse gin, the coal yard, 2 flats. Against that he set the debts, the manor rent, and a sum for dilapidations that Rachel did not believe. That leaves the moss holding, Peck said. The low pans. 3 pans, 1 shaft, sheds, and a cottage. £9. Rachel had been standing at the end of the table with her bonnet still on. £9. They've not been worked in my time in the trade. They were worked in 39. Peck looked at Hurdis the way a clerk looks at the man who pays him. Hurdis had the sort of face that people trusted at chapel. He was 51 that spring, heavy through the shoulders, careful about his collar. He did not laugh at her. That was the thing she remembered afterward. He came round the table and put his hand flat on the schedule, as if he were steadying it for her. Your uncle was fond of you, Rachel. Nobody says otherwise. But the moss ate that pit before either of us was breached. Then you'll not mind me having it. Take the £9, he said. It's clean money. I'll take it in kind. The room went quiet in a way that told her something. Cropper looked up from the fire. Peck turned a page he had already turned. Old Wilf Roylance had brought the deed box up from the wharf and had no business being in the room at all. He stood by the door with his cap in both hands and said nothing. Mr. Winnington, her uncle's attorney, took her out to the landing and spoke low. If you take the holding in kind, you sign a release. All further claim on the estate and on the firm. Every rate and arrear on that land comes to you with it, and there are arrears. How much? £6.12, and it will be 7 by Michaelmas. And if I take the money, then you have £9 and no roof. And in a year you have nothing and no roof. She looked past him at the river. 2 flats were working up to the wharf loaded with rock salt from the mines, and a boy was walking the horse along the towpath with his coat over his head against the rain. Draw it, she said. Peck wrote the schedule out fair. He was a careful man, and he did not think twice about what he was copying. He took the old wording straight out of the manor book. The pit called the low pit, and the shaft thereof, and all brine rights thereto belonging. £9. Hurdis signed it without reading past the figure. Rachel signed the release under it. Hurdis walked her down the counting-house stairs himself and put the key into her hand at the wharf gate. It was an iron key with a wire loop on it, and it was warm from his pocket. Take a man out with you the first time, he said. The moss isn't kind to a woman on her own. I was born on it. So you were. He put his hat on. God bless the work, Rachel. She walked home along the towpath with the key in her fist, and the release folded small in her glove, and she did not open her hand until she was through her own door. The moss road ran 3/4 of a mile out of Saltworks between drains, and the turnpike trustees kept a gate on it because of the turf carts. Ellis Naden had the gate. He came out in his shirt sleeves in the first week of April and looked at her handcart and then at her. "Threepence for the cart. I'm not carrying to sell. Threepence for the cart," he said again, and he said it kindly. When she paid, he wrote it in a ruled book on the sill of his window. Date and load and payer, in a hand better than most clerks had. There was a rain gauge on a post behind his gate, with a brass funnel in it, and a second book for that. "Trustees want the rain wrote down," he said, when he saw her looking. "Been wrote down since '41. Nobody's ever asked me for it." The work stood at the end of the track where the firm ground gave out and the moss began. She had not been out to it since she was a girl. The pan house was 40 feet long and built of thin brick, and the roof over the eastern bays had let go, so that 4 rafters hung down into the room like broken fingers. Pan number 1 had rusted through in 9 places and would hold nothing but rain. Pan number 3 was cracked clean across the bed and past saving. Pan number 2 was warped along its length and sound. The lofting room over the flue was dry. That was the first good thing. Salt houses were built so that the waste heat from the fires ran under the drying floor. And even cold, after 16 years, that room was drier than any room in the village. The cottage at the north end had no roof over the bedchamber. There was a fireplace, a floor of blue brick, and a starling's nest in the chimney. The shaft sat in a walled square of hard ground 20 yards from the pan house door. It was 4 feet across, brick to the top, and capped with an oak plug that had gone black and soft on the surface. The chain pump frame beside it had rotted at the foot and leaned. She had £4, 3 shillings, a rate demand for £6.12, and no coal. Mrs. Sefton at the shop was polite about it. "I'll not give credit on a moss holding, Rachel. I gave credit to your uncle, and I'm still whistling. You'll take my money when I have it. I'll take anybody's." Rachel went back out and started on the plug because it was the only thing she could do without money. She worked the soft face off it with a hand adze until she came to sound oak underneath. And then she stopped because the plug had been cut. It was no lid dropped on a dead hole. It had been turned to a taper and driven, and there was tarred rope caulked into the joint all the way round. She sat back on her heels with the adze across her knee. A man abandoning a pit walks away. A man who drives a fitted plug and caulks it means to keep something out. She got a nail bar under the rim and could not shift it, and by then the light was going. She went into the pan house to find a place to sleep and set her candle on the ledge in the second bay, where the limewash had blistered off the wall in sheets. There were figures under the limewash. Columns of them, in chalk, 4 fingers high, running along the brick at the height of a woman's hand. She held the candle up close. Dates down the left. Then a word she could not read. Then numbers between 80 and 97. And at the end of each line, a single letter, F or C. The last line had no letter after it at all. Wilf Roylance came out on the Moss Road at the end of April without being asked. He was 68, and his chest whistled going uphill, and there was no hill on the moss. "You'll want the pan riveted," he said, by way of greeting. "I've no money for a smith." I never said a smith. He had walled at the low pans for 19 years before the firm shut them, and he still carried his own scaling hammer in a sack. They spent 9 days on pan number 2. Wilf cut patches from the ruin of number 1. Rachel drilled and set the copper rivets. They beat a paste of salt, lime, and bullock's blood into the seams the way he had been taught. Let it dry, and did the bad seam twice. Alf Tunnicliffe, who brought coal up the cut on his flat, let her have 3 tons at 8 shillings on the promise of the first salt. He did it in front of 2 other boatmen, so that she could not pretend later that she had not asked. "You'll not make it back," he said cheerfully. "Nobody's made salt on the moss since I was a lad. Then you'll have lost 24 shillings and a story to tell." The first fire went in on the 15th of May. She had cleaned the flue herself, lying on her back in the ash bay with a sack over her face, and the draught came up sweet on the first try. Brine came out of the shaft by bucket, because the pump was rotten and there was no money for a pump. It took her 4 hours to fill the pan to the working depth, and by the end of it, the rope had cut a groove in her palm that stayed for a year. Fine salt is not made by leaving brine alone. She fired it hard and kept it just short of a rolling boil. She stood over it with the skimmer, taking off the scale as it rose. Scale is what makes salt bitter and gray, and what makes a dairyman send it back. When the grain began to form on the surface, she watched the feather of it, the fine lace that runs and knits, and she knew within an hour of the right time. She drew it with the skimmer into the conical tubs and let them drain, turned the lumps out, and carried them up into the lofting room to dry over the flue. 1,100 weight, and every ounce of it white. Wilf sat down on an upturned tub and could not get his breath for a while, and made a joke about it that neither of them laughed at. Bridget Halsall rode out on the 6th of June to see the woman who was boiling salt in a ruin. She was 26, and her father bought for 11 cheese dairies between Saltery and Nantwich. And she had come, she said plainly, because it would be a story either way. She took a lump off the shelf and broke it, and looked at the fracture, and put a little on her tongue. And then she stopped being amused. "Where's this from?" "The shaft outside. That shaft's dead. Everybody says so. Everybody's had 1,100 weight out of it this month." Bridget went to the door and looked at the walled square and the black plug and came back. "Our dairies take Hurdis fine. It sweats. In August it goes to a paste in the barrel, and it puts a taint on the rind, and my father argues with him twice a year and gets nowhere." She turned the lump over. "This is dry. It'll stay dry. You'll say that. Take a stone of it and leave it on a dairy floor till Michaelmas," Rachel said. "Then come and tell me what I'll say." Bridget bought the 1,100 weight for 14 shillings, which was less than it was worth and more than anyone else had offered, and paid for it in silver on the panhouse step. That night, Rachel ruled a page in a penny memorandum book and wrote the date and the load and the price and the buyer. It was the first line in it. In August, she lifted a board in the lofting room to get at a joist that had gone spongy at the wall end. A tin candle box lay between the joists in the dry, with the lid wired down. There were 4 books in it. They were not ledgers. They were the sort of stitched paper books that a careful person makes for themselves, and the columns in them were ruled by hand, in the same hand as the chalk on the wall. Date. River at the Moss Gauge. Weather. Degrees. Grain. The first was headed in ink on the inside board. A. Delves. Her book. Begun at the low pit. March. 1817. Rachel sat on the floor in the loft with the candle beside her and read until the candle went out, and then she went down and got another one. Ann Delves had gauged that pit every working day for 22 years. She had written the river state at Naden's gauge before it was Naden's gauge. She had written the weather in 5 words or fewer, the degrees of the brine, and whether the salt came fine or coarse. By the 4th night, Rachel had seen the thing she did not want to see. In wet weeks, the degrees went up, not by a little. In the flood of October 1824, the brine at the low pit had run from 88 to 96 in 4 days, while the river was over the moss, and every drain in the parish was backing up. In the drought of 1826, it had fallen to 79. That is not how water works. Rain thins brine. Every man in the trade knew it. Her father had taught it to her before she could reach the pan rim. Ann Delves had written the opposite down 400 times in a clear hand. There is a kind of anger that comes from being made a fool of by somebody dead. Rachel got as far as the flue door, with the second book in her hand. She could find one reason for those figures, and no other. Anne had been salting her own pit, throwing waste lump down the shaft before the gauging to keep her place. 4 months of Rachel's life had gone into somebody's cheat. She stood there with the door open and the draft pulling at the pages, and she did not do it. She told herself afterward that it was because the books were not hers to burn. That was part of it. The other part was the chalk on the wall downstairs, which had been left where the next person would put their hand. She went to Naden instead, in the last week of August, and asked to see the rain book. "Which year?" "All of them, you have." He brought a stack out onto the sill and let her sit on his bench with them. He gave her tea in a cup with no handle and told her about his sister in Warrington for an hour while she copied figures. The trustee's reign went back to 1841 only. That was 2 years after Anne's last line, but it went forward to that morning, and Rachel wrote the wet weeks of her own year against her own readings, and it was already there in her own hand, small and undeniable. The week of rain in July. 80. 1 on the Monday. 80. 6 on the Friday. She had made salt that week and thought nothing of it. The roof took most of what Bridget's money brought in. Tom Bostock was 19, cut turf with his father, and would work for food and a shilling. Between them they got 2 bays, covered with second-hand slate off a barn at Moss Hay. They rebuilt the flue arch in the second bay, with bricks pulled out of the fallen cottage wall. £2.14 for lime, sand, slate, and the loan of a ladder. Wilf was laid up a fortnight in September and could not come out at all, and she did the scaling alone, and her hands split at the knuckles and would not close in the morning. She could not make the figures mean anything honest. So she decided to stop reading dead women's books and wait for the water. She did not have to wait long. The plug had beaten her since April. She had tried the nail bar and a hooked chain and a length of gas pipe borrowed from the wheelwright, and all it had done was polish the oak. In the second week of November, the weaver came over the meadows above Salterhey, and the moss went under from the moss gate outward. The turf stacks floated. Naden shut his gate and sat in his window with his feet on the fender. Alf Tunnicliffe tied up at Moss Hay and would not bring the flat further. Rachel walked out along the wet track with the borrowed jack on her shoulder and got the plug off at 4 in the afternoon, in the rain, with Tom Bostock sitting on the end of the lever. That was the day she hauled up the line and read it on the stem in the last of the light and got 96. She read it again at 7 the next morning with a dry glass and a clean bucket, standing with her back to the wind, and it was 96 still. On the third day, it was 97. The floodwater lay a foot deep over the walled square, and she stood in it to her boot tops. The brine that came up was stronger than anything she had drawn in her life. It beat the best liquor the firm pumped at the bank pit in the driest August she could remember. She read it every morning for 11 days and wrote every reading down. On the 5th day, she stopped believing it was an accident. She got Ann Delves's sounding line out of the tin box. It had knots worked into it every foot and a lead at the end. A woman who ruled her own columns had made her own line too. The firm's plan of the low pit had hung in the office over the wharf since Rachel was a girl. She had stared at it often enough to see it with her eyes shut. 19 feet. Sunk. 1,802. Deepened 1,819. Failed 1,836. The line went down 28 feet before it touched, and there was still weight on it. And when she paid out more, it went on to 31 and stopped hard. She sat on the wall of the square with the wet line across her knees and the count going round in her head. 12 feet of shaft that the firm did not admit to. She should have waited for the water to fall. She knew that at the time, and she did it anyway. On the 12th day, she rigged the windlass over the shaft, with Tom on the handle and a candle in a wire cage. She went down in a bight of rope with her skirts tied at the knee. The brick lining went down clean and cold. Behind it, where a course had fallen out at 15 feet, she could see what was holding the water back. The shaft was cased in oak, and the oak was packed behind with puddled clay, blue and greasy, worked in by hand and still perfect after 36 years. Not a drop of the moss came through it. At 27 feet, the brick and the timber both ended, and she was hanging in rock. It was dressed rock. Somebody had cut a ledge in it a foot wide to stand on. 2 iron staples were set into the face for a tackle. On the flat of the ledge, cut with a chisel and picked out square, was a date and 2 letters. 1719 Sam. A D. Below the ledge the shaft went on down into the rock, and the water in it was black and quite still. She was reaching for the candle cage to hold it lower when the flame went yellow and stood up long and thin, and her ears began to sing. Up, she said, and then she said it louder. Tom got her up. She was sick over the wall of the square for a while, then lay on her back in the wet with her arm over her eyes. In her right hand, she still had the 2 things she had picked off the ledge: a broken clay pipe stem and a strip of lead about the size of a finger with 2 letters stamped into it, and the rest torn away. Somebody had paid to sink 12 feet through solid rock in 1819. They had cased and puddled the shaft above it like a man building for 100 years. The firm's own plan called it 19 feet and failed. That night Rachel ruled a new book. She sat at the loft table with a straight edge and a pen. She ruled 5 columns exactly as Anne Delves had ruled hers: date, river, weather, degrees, grain. She copied her 11 readings in and wrote her own name and the date on the inside board. Garnet Hurdis came out to the low pans on the 2nd of January in a gig with a rug over his knees. He looked at the roof and the 2 bays that were slated and the smoke coming out of the pan house, and he did not pretend that he had come by chance. "You've done more than I thought you'd do," he said. "I'll say that to anybody. Say it to Mrs. Sefton." He laughed at that, which she had not expected. Then he stood in her pan house and warmed his hands at her fire. He offered £120 for the holding, the shaft and all rights, with the rates cleared by him from the day of signing. £120 was a cottage in the village with a slate roof and a garden. It was 6 years of a waller's wages. It was Wilf, out of the damp, for the rest of his life. "Why?" she said. "Because the trustees are going to want that road drained, and the moss is going to want draining with it. And I'd sooner own both sides of the ditch." "There's no ditch." "There will be." He turned round with his back to the fire, comfortable as a man in his own parlor. "And there's the other thing. Rachel, you've an old man out here with a chest on him that won't see 2 more winters in a pan house. I'll put Roylance back on the firm's books tomorrow. Light work at the wharf, a room off the yard, and 8 shillings a week for as long as he lives. I'll do it whatever you answer, but I'd sooner do it as a friend of the family." Wilf was standing in the doorway behind him with an armful of split kindling. She said no. She said it too quickly and without looking at Wilf. And that was the thing she could not undo afterward. Hurdis took it very well. He put his hat on and told her to think about it until Lady Day, and drove away down the track with the wheels throwing water. Wilf put the kindling down in the corner and stacked it properly, taking his time over it. 8 shillings, he said. "Take it. Take it tomorrow. I'll not hold it against you. You'd have me at his wharf." He straightened up slowly, a hand on the small of his back, carrying his sacks. "While you're out here proving what that Pitt did before he was ever in the trade, Wilf, you didn't ask me," he said. "That's all. You could have asked me, and had the same answer. And I'd have had the asking." He went in the morning, and he did not take Hurdis's offer either, which was worse. He went back to his sister's house in the village, and did not come out on the Moss Road again for 9 months. She worked that winter on her own. She fired the pan 4 days in 10 because coal cost 8 shillings, and Bridget's dairies wanted a hundredweight, a fortnight at most until the summer cheese came in. She burned her forearm on the pan rim in February and dressed it herself. The rates went unpaid, and at night, by rushlight, with her fingers too stiff to hold a pen properly for the first half hour, she copied out Anne Delves's books. She got through the first and the second by the middle of March. 410 pages of another woman's columns in her own hand. She carried the fair copies into Salterhay, put them into Mr. Winnington's strongbox, and made him write her a receipt. "You want these kept from fire," he said. "From fire. And from anything else?" "Yes." He looked at her over his spectacles for a moment, and then wrote out the receipt without asking the other question. He was a slow, tired, honest man who had not made much of his practice, and she had chosen him for the second of those things, and would have to live with the first. She kept the originals in the tin box in the loft where she could reach them. In Book 2, in the margin of the entries for the flood of October 1824, Anne Delves had written 19 words that Rachel copied twice because she wanted to be sure of them. The moss lies on it like a hand. When the water comes on, the moss it presses, and the deep liquor rises. In September of 1856, Rachel wrote a figure on a half-sheet of paper, folded it, sealed it with a candle, and carried it to Winnington's office. "What is it?" "It's what the bank pit brine will read on the third day of the next flood," she said. "Put your date on the outside, and lock it up, and don't open it for anybody but a judge." Winnington held it a moment. "You've never gauged the bank pit." "I gauged it for 11 years for my uncle," Rachel said. "It's the same water it always was. It just isn't the same as mine." The distress came on the 19th of September, 1856. Hurdis had been an overseer of the poor for 11 years and a turnpike trustee for 9, and he had never once had to raise his voice in either office. The rates on the low pans stood at £7 4 with costs. The vestry ordered the warrant, and 2 men came out from Northwich with a cart. They took pan number 2 off its brickwork. It took them most of a day. To get it out, they knocked the head off the flue arch in the second bay. The arch she and Tom had rebuilt the September before. They took the coal as well, 1 ton and 11 hundredweight, and gave her a paper for it. "You can redeem within 5 days," the elder of the two said, not unkindly. "With what?" He looked at the pan house and did not answer that. The trustee's notice came on the 24th. Mr. Sowerbutts, surveyor, had reported to the board on the working of the shaft at the low pans. It was drawing brine from beneath the line of the Moss Road. Subsidence had been observed at the 200th yard. The road was in danger. The board required the shaft to be stopped until the matter was determined. Rachel walked the 200th yard 3 times with a straight edge and a plumb bob. There was a dip in it. There had been a dip in it since 1849, when the firm sank the bank pit 800 yards the other side of it. And every turf cutter in the parish could have told the board so. She wrote that to the board in a plain letter, and they acknowledged it and did nothing. On the night of the 4th of October, she was in the village buying candles. Somebody came out along the track and put a shoulder to the loft door, which had no lock worth the name. They took the tin candle box out from between the joists. They took the 4 books and the strip of lead. They left Anne Delves's sounding line hanging on its nail, because a sounding line is worth nothing. Rachel stood in the loft with the lantern for a long time. Then she went down and sat on the pan-house step in the dark, in the smell of cold iron and old brine. In March she had carried 2 fair copies into Winnington's strongbox. She had left the originals of all 4 where a man could reach them off a ladder. Nobody had made her do that. She had done it because the loft was dry, and because she liked having them, and because she had not believed until that week that anybody would come. She was still sitting there at 11 when Wilf Roylance came up the track with a stick. He had heard it in the village within the hour, the way everything was heard in Salterhay. He stood in front of her and got his breath and would not sit down. "Who?" she said. "I passed Sowerbutts on the Moss Road at 7 with a sack under his arm and his gig at the gate. He said good night to me, called me by my name." And quote, Naden will have him in the toll book. Naden's book has him going out at 4 and coming back at 7:10. Wilf sat down then, on the step beside her, because his legs made him. He'll say he was surveying. He'll say that. They sat for a while. The moss made the small sounds it made at night. "I should have asked you," Rachel said. "You should. I'm asking now. There's no pan, there's no coal. There's a notice on the shaft, and the books are gone." Wilf turned his cap over in his hands. "What have you left?" 2 of the 4. "In a lawyer's box. in my own writing. 15 years of her readings, and 2 years of mine, and a wall with chalk on it. Then you've got more than she had, he said, and she got it out of that hole with a bucket. Mr. Winnington took 9 days over the Manor Court rolls in the vestry chest, which was longer than it should have taken because he did it at night and because his eyes were bad. He found it on the 16th of October and sent Tom Bostock out to the Moss to fetch her. The rolls recorded a grant of 1,802 to one Nathaniel Delves and his heirs. It gave liberty to sink, pump, and draw brine at the place called the Low Pit, together with the shaft thereof, saving to the Lord the surface and the turf. The brine was granted as a thing on its own. It had never been part of the soil, and the soil had been sold twice since without touching it. Your uncle held that right personally from 49, Winnington said. It was never partnership property, whatever Hurdis believed, and it did not pass to him under the option. Then where is it? He turned Peck's schedule round on the desk and put his finger on the line. The pit called the Low Pit, and the shaft thereof, and all brine rights thereto belonging. £9. He conveyed it to you himself, Winnington said. Signed at the foot. He valued it at £9 because he was certain it was worth nothing, and a man cannot afterward say that his own valuation was a lie without saying what he is. Rachel sat down. The rest came in pieces over that month, and most of it came out of the 2 books in Winnington's strongbox and out of things she already had. Anne Delves had been brine woman at the Low Pit for 22 years. In 1819 she had persuaded the widow who then held it to spend more than the place was worth. They drove the shaft 12 feet through the rock head and cased it in oak. Behind the casing they packed puddled clay from the ditch bottom, so the moss water could not get at it. She had cut the year and her letters on the ledge herself, or watched them cut. After that, the deep liquor was shut away from the surface. When the floods came, the moss took up the weight of the water and pressed. The liquor rose in the shaft, and the brine came stronger. Rachel's father had learned the trade at that pit. In the backboard of Book 2, in a hand she had known all her life, was one line. Learned this of A. Delves, 1,834, and never yet found her wrong. In 1839 the firm was drawing all it wanted out of the town pit behind the witch house. On Shallow Head, 400 yards from the wharf and the coal. It was cheap brine to raise and cheap salt to cart, and it carried the bitterns that made it sweat in a dairy in August. A working Low Pit would have stood beside it as a comparison every day of the year. When the town pit began to fail, they sank the bank pit in 1849 on the same Shallow Head and told the trade it was the strongest brine in Cheshire, so they shut it. They plugged the shaft. That cost money, and nobody spends money plugging a failed pit. They entered it in the plan as 19 feet and failed in 1836, and they took Anne Delves off the books. She died the following spring at her sister's house. None of it was written down anywhere except in 4 stitched books, in a tin candle box, in the driest room she knew. The last chalk line on the pan house wall had no letter after it because nobody drew that pan. On the 22nd of October the water came over the moss again. Rachel gauged her shaft on the 3rd day and got 96. She had no pan and no coal, so she stood in the flood and gauged it anyway, and wrote it down. That week Alf Tunnicliffe tied up at Moss Hay and walked out to her with his freight book under his coat. His flat had carried 60 tons of Droitwich lump up to Hurdis's wharf in August. He had been wondering ever since why a salt maker buys salt. The board sat on the road objection at Saltworks School on the 11th of November, and Mr. Lyle Fenwick came out from Chester to hear it. Hurdis wanted the shaft stopped for good, and he wanted it settled. And so his own attorney drew the submission that let Fenwick determine the brine right at the same sitting. Winnington read it over twice at his desk. He has given us the room, he said. They took the desks out of Saltworks School and set them along the wall, and the room still held only about 60. There were more than 60. Men stood in the porch with the door open and the cold coming in. And Mrs. Sefton sat at the back with her hands in her lap and her mouth flat. Mr. Lyle Fenwick was a small, dry barrister who had come out from Chester on the early train and made it clear he intended to catch the late one. Hurdis's attorney was a Mr. Tarvin from Nantwich. He opened on the road. Subsidence, at the 200th yard. A public highway. A shaft worked without survey or skill, by a person who had never held a certificate of any kind, and whose own uncle had valued the whole concern at £9. £9, Tarvin said again, and let it sit. Sowerbutts gave the survey. He was thorough, and he was clear, and he had levels and a section drawing. And when he sat down, half the room believed him. Winnington got up slowly. Mr. Sowerbutts, when did the dip at the 200th yard first appear in the trustees' minutes? I could not say from memory. August 1850. Would you accept that? If it is in the minutes. It is. When was the bank pit sunk? 1849. How far is the bank pit from the 200th yard? A pause. About 800 yards. And the low pit? 1200. So the pit that is nearer, and was sunk the year before the dip appeared, is Mr. Hurdis's. Tarvin was on his feet before the answer, and Fenwick let it go, and everybody in the room had heard it anyway. Then Rachel stood up, because Winnington had told her that some of it she would have to do herself. She described the casing. Oak, from the collar to the rock head at 27 feet, packed behind with puddled clay. She said she had seen it at 15 feet, where a course of brick had fallen, and had touched it, and that it was dry behind. She said a shaft cased that way cannot draw from the moss, because the moss cannot get into it, and that this was the whole point of the work, and had been since 1819. You have been down it, Fenwick said. Yes, alone, with a windlass and a lad on the handle. It was badly done, and I would not do it that way again. Fenwick wrote something. Go on. She put in the 1802 grant from the manor roll, and the entry of it in the parish copy. And then Winnington laid Peck's schedule on the table and read the line out, and asked Mr. Hurdis whether that was his signature at the foot of it. Hurdis said that it was. He said a good deal more, because Tarvin put him up to answer the Brine right. And he was fluent, and he was calm, and he had been believed in that parish for 30 years. The low pit had failed in 1836. Every man in the trade knew it. The plan showed 19 feet. The plug had been driven for the safety of the public. His own bank pit was and always had been the strongest brine in Saltworks. The suggestion that it had weakened was got up by a woman who had lost her place and could not bear it. It has never weakened, he said. Not in my time. Not in my father-in-law's. Winnington asked Mr. Fenwick to send for a sealed paper lodged in his office on the 18th of September and not opened since. Fenwick sent his own clerk with a note. They waited 40 minutes. The room got hot, and somebody opened the far window, and the men in the porch came further in. Rachel sat with her hands flat on her knees, the way she had stood at her uncle's table. She did not look at Hurdis. She looked at the stove ledge behind the arbitrator's chair. 2 saucers had been standing there since 10 that morning, each on a square of white paper, each holding an ounce of fine salt. One was hers. One had been bought that week from Hurdis's wharf by Mr. Halsall's man in the ordinary way of business, with a bill for it. The clerk came back. Fenwick broke the seal himself. The paper is dated the 18th of September and bears one figure. 74. 74 what? Said Tarvin. Miss Cardew? Rachel stood. Degrees. It is what the bank pit brine would read on the 3rd day of the next flood. The flood came on the 22nd of October. Mr. Hurdis keeps a gauge book at the bank pit because my uncle made him start one in 49, and I asked that it be sent for. Tarvin objected. Fenwick observed that Mr. Hurdis had himself put the strength of his brine in issue, twice in the last quarter of an hour, and sent his clerk out again with a second note. It was the longest hour of Rachel's life, and she spent most of it looking at 2 saucers. The book came. Fenwick turned the leaves and found the 24th of October and read the entry into the room. 75. Nobody said anything at all for a moment. Then Bridget Halsall laughed once and put her hand over her mouth, and her father did not reprove her. "And the low pit on the same day?" Fenwick asked. 96, Rachel said. "Written in my own book, against Mr. Naden's reign, which the trustees have kept since 41, and which is on the table behind you." Fenwick had the 2 saucers brought to him. Rachel's salt poured off the paper dry and left the paper white. The other had gone gray at the edges and clung, and when he tipped it, the paper stayed damp in the shape of it, and he passed it along the table to Mr. Halsall and to 2 dairy farmers from Odlum, who did not need a chemist to tell them what they were holding. Alf Tunnicliffe was called last and read out of his freight book. 60 tons of Droitwich lump landed at Hurdis and Cropper's wharf, the 11th and 19th of August, 1856. Mr. Halsall stood up in his place without being asked to. "We were invoiced 190 tons of salter fine in August." Fenwick took 2 days and gave his award in writing. The objection was dismissed, and the notice on the shaft discharged. The brine right at the low pit was declared to be in Rachel Cardew, under the schedule of March 1855, and the grant of 1802. Costs followed. He also directed that the evidence of Ellis Naden's toll book and of Wilfred Roylance be laid before the magistrates. That is how sowerbutts came to be committed in the new year. Hurdis went out through the school porch with his hat already on. He did not look at her, and she found that she had not wanted him to. Pan number 2 had never been sold. It was still lying in the yard at Northwich under a tarpaulin. Nobody in the trade would give a fair price for a warped pan out of a moss holding. In the first week of December, Rachel bought it back for £4.10. Out of money, Mr. Halsall advanced against a contract for the spring. Wilf and Tom reset it on new brickwork between the 8th and the 23rd. Wilf did the leveling sitting down, with a straight edge and a cork and water level on a plank, and swore at both of them. And the pan sat true. She fired it on Christmas Eve because she wanted to. Garnet Hurdis came out on the Moss Road on the 19th of January, on foot, because the gig had gone. She saw him from the pan house door and went back to the pan. The grain had begun to knit. There is no part of the work where a quarter of an hour matters more. She took the skimmer and drew it, filled the tubs, let them drain, and only then went out into the yard, wiping her hands. He was standing by the shaft wall with his hat in his hands. Halsall and Son had given him notice on the 28th of November, and 2 other factors within the fortnight. 4 of his 6 pans were cold. He had an order in his pocket from a Liverpool house for 400 tons of fine dairy salt before the end of July. He had taken it in October, when he still believed he could fill it. "You'll have heard about the Liverpool order," he said. "I'd heard. I'll buy brine off you. Or salt. Your price." Rachel had thought about this for 11 weeks and had expected to enjoy it, and did not. 21 shillings a ton at my door, she said. Carted by Tunnicliffe, weighed at the Moss Gate, paid monthly, and a month in front, and it goes to Liverpool in my sacks with my mark on them. And you write to that house today and tell them whose salt they are buying. That finishes me in this parish. You finished Anne Delves in this parish, she said. It took her one line in a book. He stood there turning the hat. Away over the moss, the light was coming down the way it does in January, thin and yellow along the drains. I never knew her, he said at last. No. You just kept her shut. He signed for the first 100 tons on the panhouse step, on the flat of the deed box, and walked back down the track. Cropper bought him out in April, and he went to a brother of his at Runcorn, and Salter he talked about it for a year, and then stopped. The shaft was recased at the 15-foot fall in the summer of 1857. 2 Northwich sinkers charged her £11 and told her the 1,819 work below them was better than anything they could do. She put a proper chain pump on a stone frame that August and stopped carrying brine in buckets after 2 years and 3 months. By the following spring there were 4 pans running, 3 fine and 1 common. 14 women worked the lofting room and the screening room at the same wage the firm had paid its men for that work. That caused more argument in the village than anything else she ever did. 9 men worked the pans and the yard. Tom Bostock was indentured at 22, late, because his father wanted him on the turf until then. The price stayed at 21 shillings for the Cheshire dairies, and it was written into the contracts that it could not be raised while the pit held its strength. The salt ring at Northwich came out to look at her books twice and went away again. In the winter, she sent a hundredweight to every name on the parish list for the curing, and made no announcement of it. And Mrs. Sefton took hers and sent her boy for more in February, and still did not speak to her in the street, and never really did. The school roof was done by subscription in 1859. Her name was on the list under Halsall's and above Naden's, in the middle of the paper where nobody looks. The 4 books never came back. Sower Butts got 4 months and never said what he had done with them. Rachel came to think they had gone in a fire the same night. It was the only thing that made sense of a man paid to make them stop existing. She had the copies of the first 2. She had her own. By then, 5 of them. Wilf Roylance kept the gauge until the spring of 1861. There was a chair for him at the end of the flue where the wall stayed warm, and a slate on a nail. Every morning somebody carried the bucket to him. He read the stem and called the figure out, and Tom wrote it down. He was wrong about twice a year and would not be told. He taught 4 people to gauge before he died, and 2 of them were girls. He made a great deal of noise about that in the Coach and Horses, which was the point of it. Bridget Halsall took a 3rd share in the selling side in 1858 and argued with Rachel about credit terms for 18 years. The board over the panhouse door was painted by a man from Winsford in the summer of 1857. Rachel gave him the wording on a scrap of paper and stood in the yard while he did it. Wilf watched from his chair. Tom held the ladder and got paint on his sleeve. Delves and Cardew. Saltery. Fine salt. That evening she took a new book up to the loft table and a straight edge and ruled it in 5 columns the way it had always been done at that pit. Date, river, weather, degrees, grain. She wrote her own name inside the board, and under it, because there was room and because it was true, she wrote the other one. Then she turned to the first page and put down the 19th of August, the river low, fine and warm, 91. She drew the line under it and left the book open on the table for the morning.